He said the back door, right?
Pretty sure.
I mean, this is a pretty narrow entryway.
Hello?
Hello, Jason? Is that you?
What the heck?
Oh, hey.
The back door's over there.
Once Nick and I found our way into Jason's shop, we immediately walked out and over to his garage where he was storing a healthy stack of walnut for this project. But before we could start cutting any of this glorious timber up, we needed to do some calculations to figure out the exact dimensions of our shuffleboard table. And if you recall, Jason and I's octagonal bench build that we did for Neil Patrick Harris,
I was like 108, 18, total. Outer part is 28 inches.
So yeah, we felt 100% comfortable in trusting him with the number crunching on this one. Now, our original intention here was to do a straight line rip with the track saw and then head over to the joiner to tidy up all these edges, but we tried, and even with 3 people trying to edge joint a 10-foot piece of 2x6, walnut just wasn't happening. So Jason and I took a 5-minute break to discuss and then handed the saw off to Nick to finish up. Once we had a straight-ish edge on the pieces we needed for our butcher block top, we trotted down to the table saw to rip our pieces to rough width, where I nearly sustained blunt force trauma to the cranium. And since this butcher block is going to get glued up and then planed on both sides after the glue up, these edges really didn't need to be perfect. And then back at the bench, we played some walnut stick shuffle to make sure that our grain and coloring all looked good and consistent. Yeah, I suppose if we cut here and spin this here, yeah. And then to confirm that our table dimensions were going to be regulation size and not be subject to disqualification during tournament play, we consulted the most reliable source we could think of. Well, besides Wikipedia. Google. To cut our butcher block pieces to rough length, Jason took out his finest trim saws for the cleanest possible cuts. And then it was over to the planer to get all the faces nice and smooth and prepped for glue up. Now, our butcher block top is 15 pieces wide, so rather than do it all in one giant chunk, we decided to do it in 2 sections, glue those separately, and then glue those 2 blocks together. Now, the dry fit went off without a hitch, and we thought we could get away without using dominoes or biscuits or dowels for alignment purposes. Well, as you can see here, it was a bit of a freak show. Lesson learned. So with glue up number 1 safely in the clamps, it was time to start working on the leg template. Now, we had absolutely no preconceived design when we arrived here in Oregon at Jason's shop, so we just kind of batted around some ideas. We knew we wanted something modern and minimalistic, so we came up with a Y. And as you can see, this smaller radius here complements the larger radius here, although Jason had his own design aesthetic he wanted us to consider. We decided that may not be a good idea. And with that settled, we could move on to part 2 of our butcher block glue up, where we decided to use dominoes for alignment to save us a headache. But when we needed help with this glue up, oddly enough, the back door was open and Jason was gone. So with Nick and I left to fend for ourselves, we started rolling on some glue, popping in those dominoes for alignment, and getting everything clamped up with just a fraction of the amount of clamps that we used on the first debacle. And when Jason finally decided to reappear, we headed over to the table saw to rip to width the outer frame of our shuffleboard table, which was about 6 inches wide, and then we headed over to the planer to give each side a smooth finish and discuss what we were going to have for lunch that day. And if I recall correctly, this was Taco Truck Tuesday. Now, we also needed to rabbet out the bottom of these, and in my effort to look cool swinging this push grip around, I failed miserably. But I blame that on the push block. Now, with our dado stack set to 3/4 of an inch height, we made our first pass. Look at that team effort right there. And then our second pass to get the full depth that we wanted, which was roughly 1.25 inches, if I recall correctly, which is doubtful. Then we could accurately and precisionally put the 45-degree miter cuts on all the pieces for the frame and give them the required taste test. Back at the bench, we could do a quick dry fit and make sure all the miters fit together tightly. Very nice. Now before we glued that up, we wanted to cut to size our bottom plywood to make sure that was going to fit and that our box was actually square. So over at the table saw, another 3-man operation for this 10-foot piece of plywood. We ripped that to about 26.5 inches, I think, and then popped it in the dry fit frame. With that looking good, we could start dominoing the miters of all our joints to ensure a nice stress-free glue up. And Jason's son was coming around doing his vlogging for his YouTube channel. And if you don't know Jason and Nick, Jason is the classic micromanager. And since Nick is a videographer by day, he always knows the perfect place to put his camera to get the best shot. Right in my way. And before gluing up the frame, we decided it best to sand those inside faces, and despite our best efforts to dissuade him otherwise, Jason insisted on doing all the sanding himself and then wouldn't stop complaining about it. And then it was time for that stress-free glue up I mentioned. Or was it? And while that glue was drying overnight, back in New Jersey, Jerry and Lola were sorely missing their shop time. And the following morning, Jason found it prudent to devour his breakfast sandwich in front of my camera. And with breakfast out of the way and our bellies full, we could use the full power of our brains that we should have done on the first miter glue up. And on this one, we just glued on some clamping blocks with some CA glue, then applied some real glue to the joint, inserted those dominoes. So, with just 4 clamping blocks, 4 clamps, and 4 dominoes in 4 minutes, and this joint was doit. And then it was back to the shaper origin, but first I decided to clean this piece of lint/spiderweb off Jason's shirt. And now we could cut the template for our leg. So, we pulled it up out of the Shaper hub that Sean from Shaper helped us program. And then with Jason driving, the machine did all the work with a 1/4-inch spiral upcut bit from Bits and Bits. And to keep the material from flying all over the place, a couple of tabs were inserted, so we cut those with a flush trim saw and then over to the belt sander to smooth that out. And then I guess someone had something better to do.
I expect some work done when I get back up.
We'll be here.
Alright, okay.
Unbelievable.
So while Jason was off doing whatever it is that he does, Nick and I were left with the important task of laying out our leg blanks. And after about 4 hours and 1,000 eye rolls, Nick finally realized how fastidious I can be with the grain selection on something like this, and wearing my shirt isn't all it's cracked up to be. Then we could rough cut our blanks as best as possible over at the miter saw, and then over to the planer to get one smooth surface on each side before we glued up the blanks. Oh right, we also needed to rough cut to our layout lines on all the template parts before gluing up said blanks. So, with Jason's Harbor Freight blade, he made quick work of this task. Well, quick may not be the proper nomenclature. It made a nice little scrap pile to burn later. And then we could start gluing up our leg blanks, first starting with the smaller portion of the Y. And if you're wondering what that chunk of wood on the side is that makes it look like a big pork chop, that will allow us to get even clamping pressure across the glue joint. And apparently the frigid temperatures we were already experiencing in Jason's shop were not cold enough for him. Jason is more productive when my morsels are able to cut glass. And then while Nick unthreaded all of the clamps we needed, and my morsels tried to get back to normal operating temperature, Jason and I spread the glue around nice and evenly, and then we could glue up those larger leg blanks with a varied and healthy amount of clamps. And while those were drying, we decided it was as good a time as any to rip our plywood bottom to its final width, which is no doubt a 3-man operation. No, your end down. No, your end down. All right, Nick, you grab the middle. Oh, maybe it was a 3-man operation. And as penance for eating his leftover chicken pad thai from the night before, Jason made me scrape all the glue off of his workbenches before moving on to running this beast of a shuffleboard top through the planer. Oh yeah, look at that hardened glue. And wait for it. That is looking mighty nice. And I'm not ashamed to say that we are lucky as all get out that we did not have to actually flatten this giant block on either side, that it came out of the planer and the clamps and the glue pretty darn flat. Watch your pinkies. Woohoo. Let's check it. Yep, that's ready for tourney play. And then we busted out the track saw to trim it to final length. Oh, there's a little bit of burning here. Keith, check it out. Yep, that's burning. What do you want to do about it? I don't know. Pretend we didn't see it? And yet again, while Jason will try to make you believe that he didn't want to do all the sanding, he did. Control freak much? So, Nick and I shared a giant bag of Big League Chew and talked about our favorite Little League memories and favorite flavors, mine being grape, Nick's being traditional bubblegum flavor. And then it was back to the Shaper Origin to carve out what we thought was a pretty cool and unique logo to put in the middle, but turned out Jason accidentally borrowed from Pinterest unknowingly. It appears that this logo is actually a business logo from About Trout, abouttrout.com. They were super cool about letting us use this logo in the table, so thank you so much for your understanding. We love the way it looks, and it's a super cool logo design. Now, why did Jason choose a geometric trout for the logo? Well, he once had a dream that he a trout, and then so it only makes sense. And then with Jason's rousing pep talk and encouragement, it was time for me to get behind the wheel. Oh, he was just buttering me up so he could leave again. And while Nick and I take turns routing out the remaining numbers and lines on the shuffleboard table, I want to talk to you guys about the sponsor of today's video, Bits and Bits. Bits and Bits is one of the leaders in the manufacturing and supplying of wood CNC router bits, high-performance end mills, engraving cutters, and other rotary cutting tools for industrial and medical applications, including dental bits that were probably used in your last teeth cleaning. Bits and Bits coat their bits with their very own proprietary Astra coating, which is a top-secret special sauce specifically formulated to lower heat buildup and extend the life of the bit 2 to 3 times while still allowing for faster feed rates. I mean, what more can you ask for in a router or CNC bit? Well, besides rubbing your feet after standing on Jason's concrete floors all day. So, go to bitsbits.com for all your bit needs and use coupon code MORSELS15 to save 15% on router and CNC bits. And with all of our letters, lines, and borrowed logos routed out, it was time to pour some epoxy in there. TotalBoat, baby! We did do some experiments. We thought some brass powder and epoxy would be a great look because that brass and walnut is a super classy look. But we found that it was just visually hard to see at the other end of the table. And when I told Jason we would have to sand the whole tabletop up to 1,000 grit, he said, "F that." So we chose instead to use the TotalBoat pigment dispersion in white to mix in with our TotalBoat high-performance epoxy. TotalBoat, baby! Which gives us super crisp contrast against the walnut. So armed with our 10 mil syringes, we went to work, carefully filling all of those voids with epoxy, trying not to get too much overspill, and then hitting it with the torch to get out any air bubbles, and then we just let that rest overnight. And yes, that is an actual recording of Nick snoring. That guy will pull the curtains off the rods and wake the dead at the same time. But it was all worth it because the next morning that planer revealed what can only be described as awesome. But unfortunately, we had to put our love affair on hold because there was work still left to do. With the leg blank parts cut to size, I put one jointed edge to give us a flat reference surface, and then over to the miter saw to cut the bottoms at an 18-degree miter. And then Jason and I, with a piece of plywood, some hold-down clamps, some CA glue, and some stop blocks, we devised this little sled here to cut that tricky little angle. And just to be safe, we used some double-sided tape to secure the workpiece so it couldn't shift around on us, because this cut is super critical to make sure the mating piece has a nice square edge for a glue joint. Next was the tricky part, and Jason convinced me to not overthink it. Now, I probably would have made some other kind of sled to make sure all these cuts were the same, but he's like, let's just do it on the miter saw. So I stepped back, let go, and let Jason take the wheel. Yes, I let him take the wheel, and they came out perfect. And then we could start dominoing. Now, we used 2 different size dominoes, 10 by 100 and 10 by 50. We couldn't use all 10 by 100s because we just didn't have the meat. A quick dry fit reveals a nice tight-fitting joint, and you can see why those clamping blocks were left on there. Oh, hey, Nick, welcome back. Now we could start spreading some glue and getting these leg blanks clamped up after a quick dual drum solo. Admittedly, we may need to practice a little bit before wedding season. I think there's definite progress there. Once the glue was dry-ish, we took it out of the clamps and cut our blanks to rough size before template routing. Then we busted out the heavy-duty double-sided tape to stick our template down onto our leg blanks and flush trim the heck out of these things. Now, unfortunately, Nick's still figuring out the power cord there. This is a 2-step operation. First, we're going to be using this massive ultimate pattern bit from Bits and Bits to make the first pass on the top. Now, the closer you cut to your layout line when you're doing your rough cut means less material you have to remove. We're a little further away than ideal, but you go slow and you let the bit do the work. And then it was a group effort to remove the template and then head over to the router table where we would now be using a bottom bearing flush trim bit from Bits and Bits to finish the cut and make one honkin' of a mess. Nice gams. With everything flush trimmed, we could finally lop off the tops and bottoms of these legs to get them to the exact height needed. This crosscut sled on the table saw did a perfect job. Well, almost perfect. That blade just wouldn't go high enough, so there was basically one layer of fibers left to trim off. And then over to the miter saw to nip off the bottom, and then Jason plugged me full of holes. After a quick med pack, I regained consciousness and we could get to work on the stretcher for the legs, which, by the way, was quite a discussion on the position of where it should go, up high, down low. Jason called me difficult. I said whatever. Nick said, hey man, he called you anal too. But we got through it. I mean, even the Partridge family had a family spat now and then. Once that dry fit was done, everything needed a nicely manicured roundover. For the legs and the stretcher, we used a 3/8" radius roundover bit from Bits and Bits. And then, much to Jason's chagrin, we talked him into letting us help him sand all these legs, getting all the roundovers smooth, the faces smooth, and getting these ready for finish. Oh, and in case you didn't know, the 3 of us have a podcast together, the Shop Sounds Podcast. Basically a woodworking podcast. It's about nothing. So if that interests you, there's a link in the description below if you want to subscribe or download an episode and have a listen. And with Jason's camera nearly centered perfectly on my shot, we could glue up these legs, which was just a few dominoes, a little glue, and a couple of clamps. Piece of cake. And just so we don't forget to do this later, we put a nice little 1/8" radius roundover over the whole shuffleboard top. Another 3-man operation, obviously. We did have a couple of odds and ends to do before applying the finish. Jason worked on the leg levelers, while I committed one of the most egregious and embarrassing crimes in my woodworking career by not editing that out. But seriously, zipping right up that crisp miter on the corner with an 1/8" roundover. At that point, no one had realized what I had done until right now when Jason was like, what the f*** are you doing? Why are you rounding over that miter? What miter? This, right here. What the f***? Oh boy. My bad. And with that settled amicably, I could move on with finishing the roundover task at hand while Stella got his groove back. And then it was time to apply the finish. We went with Rubio Monocoat Pure for this application. You've seen me use this before. You basically spread on the oil wax blend, rub it in with a Scotch-Brite pad, let it soak in for a little bit. Jason going heavy duty on the playing surface because this walnut was dry and soaking it up. Lastly were the leg assemblies, which we finished in no time. And then we could work on the gutter area, for lack of a better term, around the playing surface. We thought this kind of fake leather would look cool, but when we got it back in the shop, it was just way too orange, so we used this as a cushion. So using just some Titebond glue, we glued that down, and then this sweet green canvas on top, which was quickly made wrinkle-free as Jason relived his 1-hour martinizing days. Then with surgical-like precision, Jason trimmed off all the excess. Not quite sure where Nick was. Oh, there he is. Must have been on a union break. Then we could drop the outer walnut frame onto the plywood and canvas thing and screw everything from the bottom. I believe we used 60-inch-and-a-half screws for this operation. Flip it over, and then we could drop in the big old playing surface. Jason cut some styrofoam blocks as spacers, and if I had given him the right measurements, it would have been helpful, so we had to make an adjustment. But that was quickly forgotten as Jason screwed it from beneath while I pushed down to make sure we had nice surface contact, and then we could bring it over to the bench, flip her over, and get to attaching our legs. Jason called in a favor and had a local machine shop mill up and drill out these mounting plates for us of 1/4-inch plate steel. Then we could drill down into the playing surface from below and set some hanger bolts. There it is, folks. You asked for it. Your cam is back. Using double-sided tape, we could then stick our legs down onto that and flip everything over and drive some screws through the plates into the legs to secure them. And then back on the bottom of the table, we used a little bit of epoxy on the threads just for some added insurance as we drove those hanger bolts home. Dropped on the leg plate assemblies, ratcheted on the nuts. I put a couple screws in the outside, and then we could flip it over and give this thing a dry run. Ah, nuts. I forgot we needed to customize the pucks before any gameplay could happen, so using my trusty pocket knife, I popped those off, and then over with Shaper Origin, Nick cut us some custom inserts for the top out of walnut heartwood and walnut sapwood to give a nice contrast between the two. Used some epoxy to glue them on, some Rubio to finish them off. Jason came in and lent a hand. And then it was first time to step back and look at what we had created in the last 5 days, and then it was time to sprinkle on a little bit of wax and start pucking. Being a furniture maker and content creator can be a very solitary profession, and projects often have no meaning as they come in the shop and are quickly in the rear view and forgotten. But a project like this, where 3 friends can start with just an idea and a mere 5 days later, after a couple rounds of golf, countless laughs, gallons of coffee, and watching late-night Seinfeld reruns, a piece of furniture emerges that we don't actually want to toss in Jason's burn pile. So a sincere thank you to Jason for hosting Nick and I for the week, and to Nick for reminding me to always pack my earplugs, because you never know how thin the walls are going to be at your Airbnb. And don't forget to check out Jason and Nick's YouTube videos on this build for 2 completely different stories of the same project. Well, folks, there you have it, a 9-foot walnut shuffleboard table in just 5 days. And while I'd love to say I did this all by myself, luckily I was able to find a few guys down the line at the DMV to stop by and help me out. First off, my buddy Nick Key from Key Woodworks, all the way from Kentucky. And of course, Jason Hibbs from Bourbon Moth Woodwork that we keep in the lumber rack. Usually he says something funny at this point, but I guess it's my video, so it's my turn to be funny. But I can't think of anything. So don't forget to like this video down below so it can be shared with more people. Subscribe if you like, and we'll see you on the next one. That was better. Oh, I forgot to hit record.
Are you serious?
Acting.